If you spend any time online, you have probably heard the word dopamine, used like it is some kind of magic happiness chemical that TikTok, Instagram, video games, and junk food are constantly hijacking and destroying. You might have seen phrases like dopamine detox, dopamine hits, dopamine addiction, as if every time you check your phone or eat a cookie, a little goblin in your brain pours out a shot of dopamine and you become a bit more broken. It is a very dramatic story, simple, alarming, easy to turn into content. But the real story is quieter, more complex, and in many ways more interesting. Dopamine is not a villain and it is not a saint. It is not pure pleasure and it is not pure evil. It is one of the ways your brain keeps track of better than expected and worse than expected. It is part of how your nervous system decides what is worth moving toward and what is not worth the effort. It is a teaching signal, a prediction signal, a motivational signal. When it works well, you learn from life, adapt, grow, and sometimes feel deep satisfaction. When this system is constantly trained on shallow rewards or overwhelmed by extreme stimuli, your sense of motivation and meaning can start to warp. Understanding this makes the picture less moralistic and more mechanical. Instead of "I have ruined my dopamine," the question becomes, what am I training my dopamine system to care about? What is my brain learning, day after day, about where better than expected lives? To understand that, we need to zoom in, at least roughly, on what dopamine actually is and where it lives. Inside your brain, billions of neurons are constantly talking to each other through tiny gaps called synapses. They send electrical signals along their length, then release chemicals into these gaps to transmit information to the next neuron. Those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Dopamine is one of them. It is produced in specific clusters of neurons deep in the midbrain, especially in areas with names like the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, then projected forward along long fibers into many parts of the brain. The prefrontal cortex that helps you plan and decide, the striatum that is involved in habits and movement, the limbic regions that process emotion and value. When these dopamine-producing neurons fire in quick bursts, they release dopamine into their target areas, where it binds to receptors on other neurons and changes how likely those neurons are to fire. The important thing is that these bursts are not just about raw pleasure. If dopamine were simply a chemical representing "this feels good," then any time something pleasant happened, you would see the same pattern. But experiments show something subtler. If you take an animal that has never tasted a sweet liquid before and suddenly give it some, you do get a burst of dopamine. But if you repeat this many times, the dopamine spike gradually moves away from the moment of the sweet taste and toward whatever predicts it. The sound, the light, the cue that says, "it is about to happen." Over time, if the sweet taste arrives exactly when expected, the dopamine system goes quiet at the moment of the reward, as if saying, "this is exactly what we predicted, nothing new to learn here." If the reward is better than expected, dopamine pulses upward. If the reward is worse than expected or missing, dopamine dips below baseline. In other words, dopamine cares most about surprise and prediction error, not stable pleasure. This prediction story sounds abstract until you notice it happening in your own day. Think of something simple like checking your phone. The first time you ever got a message from someone you liked, you might have felt an intense jolt of joy, your heart rate rising, your brain lighting up with wow. Dopamine would have surged because the outcome was better than your brain's prior expectation. You did not expect that person to reach out. They did. Over time, though, your brain learns. A certain notification sound, a certain vibration pattern, a certain time of day starts to predict that there will be something rewarding on the screen. The dopamine response gradually shifts away from the content of the message and toward the cue. When your phone buzzes, there is a tiny anticipatory pulse. You reach automatically. You might not even be fully aware of any pleasure anymore. Sometimes you unlock the screen and see nothing interesting, maybe even a disappointing message. But the loop has already formed. The cue says maybe something good, the dopamine system notes possibility, and your hand moves. If the message is better than expected, you get a small upward correction. If it is worse, there is a small dip, a faint feeling of dissatisfaction. The exact same process applies to opening a social media app, refreshing a feed, checking email, looking at view counts. The action itself is often neutral or even boring, but it is attached to an unpredictable reward schedule, where sometimes you get something interesting, sometimes you do not. That unpredictability, better than expected, worse than expected, who knows, keeps the dopamine system engaged. It is not that the app is flooding your brain with dopamine nonstop. It is that the entire design teaches your dopamine system that check again, something might be there, is a good bet. This is one of the reasons the usual picture of dopamine as the pleasure chemical is misleading. If you block dopamine in certain parts of the brain, animals will still show enjoyment when something sweet is put in their mouth. Their facial expressions and licking patterns still show that it tastes good. What they stop doing is working to get it. They do not press the lever. They do not complete the maze. They do not move toward the thing, even though they still like it when it is delivered right to them. That is because dopamine is more about wanting and doing than about liking. It energizes behavior, directs attention, and reinforces actions that led to good surprises. When you feel a pull to open an app even when you are not particularly excited about what is inside, that pull is not pure pleasure. It is the residue of prior learning, times when you did get a social reward, a funny clip, an interesting post. Your dopamine system logged those as better than expected, and now it quietly nudges you to repeat the behavior that produced them. The same thing happens in other parts of life. Think of studying for an exam, or working on a project, or going to the gym. If your dopamine system has never associated these actions with positive outcomes, they will feel heavy, inert, unrewarding. Your body will resist starting, not because you are lazy in some moral sense, but because the prediction system that says, "this is worth it," has not been trained there. If, however, you have experienced meaningful rewards after such efforts, passing, achieving, feeling strong, receiving genuine appreciation, your dopamine signals will slowly begin to anticipate those outcomes when you even think about starting. Effort itself can start to feel more charged, more doable, not because it becomes physically easier, but because your brain has learned this leads somewhere good. When people talk about ruining their dopamine, what they often mean, without realizing it, is that they have spent a lot of time training their dopamine system on rewards that are intense, fast, and easy, and much less time training it on rewards that are slow, deep, and effortful. The system learns from what you do repeatedly. If most of your repeated loops are short, high stimulation, low effort actions, scrolling, refreshing, snacking, switching tabs, the brain becomes very efficient at anticipating and pursuing that kind of reward. Baseline activities with low novelty begin to feel painfully flat by comparison. Reading one page of a book feels like nothing compared to 100 new images in the same time. Sitting with your own thoughts feels empty compared to a constant stream of clips. Even conversations can start to feel slow and unsatisfying if your system is expecting the rapid, endless novelty that a feed gives. This is not because something in your brain has been burned out in a permanent way. It is because your internal prediction machinery has been calibrated to a particular rhythm and intensity. Going from that to the quieter rewards of depth, learning, craft, or simple presence is like going from very sweet food to subtly flavored food. The subtle food has not lost its taste. Your palate has lost its sensitivity. You can regain that sensitivity, but it takes time, because you have to let your dopamine system relearn that slower, subtler things can also be better than expected. It is important to say that dopamine itself is not the enemy in this story. Without dopamine, life becomes almost impossible, in conditions where dopamine neurons die off. Like Parkinson's disease, people not only struggle with movement but also often feel profound lack of motivation and an inability to initiate actions. Even basic tasks become mountain-like. In some forms of depression, Dopamine pathways that normally support motivation and reward appear blunted, which aligns with the subjective report of "I cannot make myself care. Nothing feels worth doing. Everything is gray." None of this means dopamine is the entire explanation for these conditions, but it shows how central it is to the experience of wanting, striving, and feeling that anything matters. You do not want to detox from dopamine. That would be like detoxing from the idea of this is better than nothing. You need this system to prioritize, to move, to learn. The question, again, is not whether dopamine is there, but where it is being directed, what it is being asked to care about. The modern environment is filled with engineered stimuli that are very good at capturing this system. Highly targeted content, infinite scroll, bright colors, variable rewards, notifications tuned to your interests, games designed to be just challenging enough to keep you hooked. These are not evil in themselves, but they are powerful. If they occupy most of your available attention, they will naturally become the main teachers of your dopamine pathways. The more you obey their cues, the more your brain learns that this is where the juice is. Other activities, even ones you rationally value, will feel comparatively dull, not because they are objectively meaningless, but because your internal reward spotlight has been pointed away from them for a long time. So when you sit at your desk and think, "I know I should work on this project, but I feel this incredible pull to open YouTube instead," you are not simply failing a willpower test in a vacuum. You are feeling the tug of a well-trained prediction system. Your brain has a long history of open YouTube leading to short-term, better than expected experiences. It has a shorter, weaker history of sit with this complex problem for an hour and maybe get a tiny bit closer to understanding it. This does not mean you are doomed to stay stuck. It does mean that any attempt to change your behavior will feel, at least at first, like going against the grain of your own prediction machinery. That friction is not a sign you are on the wrong path. It is a sign you are asking your dopamine system to learn something new, something slower and less immediately obvious, which takes more repetitions than the quick hits ever did. Later, we will explore what that relearning can actually look like in practice, beyond simplistic slogans. For now, it is enough to see that dopamine is not a simple on or off switch for happiness. It is a coding system for expectations and surprises, a way your brain tells itself, "This was better than we thought, do more of this." Or "This was worse than we thought, maybe do less of this." Apps, habits, relationships, hobbies, work, food, art, intimacy, learning, all of them are constantly adjusting that code. The emptiness you sometimes feel after an evening of endless stimulation is not proof that dopamine has betrayed you. It might be a sign that your prediction system has been busy chasing small, easy surprises that do not add up to much, while the deeper, slower sources of better than expected have been left unused, waiting for you to notice them again. If dopamine is a prediction and motivation signal rather than a simple pleasure tap, then a natural question follows. How do our daily habits, especially the ones we feel almost compelled to repeat, get their grip on this system? And why does it sometimes feel like our brain is working against us rather than for us? To answer that, it helps to picture your life not as a series of isolated actions, but as a network of loops. Each loop has a cue, an action, and a result. You see or feel something, you respond in a certain way, and something happens afterward that your brain quietly measures as better, worse, or about the same as expected. Dopamine pulses and dips are part of how those loops get strengthened or weakened over time. Take a very simple example. You are sitting at your desk, trying to work on something that requires focus. After a few minutes, you hit a slightly uncomfortable feeling. Maybe it is boredom, maybe mild anxiety about the task, maybe a vague restlessness. That uncomfortable feeling acts as a cue. Somewhere in your learned repertoire, there is an action that reliably reduces or distracts from that discomfort. Open your phone, check social media, open a game, browse something. The moment you initiate that action, you might already feel a tiny sense of relief, even before anything interesting appears on the screen. Then perhaps you see something that is funny or flattering or simply highly stimulating. That becomes the result, and your dopamine system notes once again that the path from uncomfortable feeling to screen produced a small but real improvement compared to how you felt a moment ago. Better than expected. Over dozens, then hundreds of repetitions, this loop becomes stronger. The cue of discomfort automatically calls up the idea of the phone. The thought of the phone carries a little sparkle of anticipation. The action of reaching out happens with minimal conscious deliberation. The result, even if mediocre, is good enough to keep the loop alive. At no point did you sit down and decide to build a habit of compulsively checking your phone whenever you feel unease. The habit arose as a natural consequence of how your brain learns to predict and reduce discomfort, with dopamine as one of the teachers. Now extend this picture to other domains. Food is an obvious one. Highly processed foods, especially those combining sugar, fat, and salt, are very efficient at producing strong reward prediction errors the first few times you eat them. They hit taste receptors intensely, flood the gut with rapidly absorbable energy, trigger hormonal responses, and the brain registers this as a big upgrade over something bland or less calorie-dense. Dopamine spikes, and the cues surrounding the food are tagged as important. The packaging, the smell, the time of day, the emotional context. Over time, as before, the dopamine response moves toward the cues. Seeing the package in the cupboard or walking past the place you usually buy it can be enough to trigger a craving. The craving is not the same as pleasure. It is the feeling of "I would rather move toward this than stay where I am," even if some other part of you knows you will not feel great afterward. Something similar happens with alcohol, nicotine, gambling, many drugs, and in more subtle forms with things like constant novelty and entertainment. The first few exposures create big positive prediction errors. The brain generalizes those and starts to anticipate rewards earlier and earlier in the sequence. Meanwhile, your physiology adapts. Receptors adjust, downstream pathways modulate so that the same dose produces less impact over time. This is tolerance. At that point, the dopamine peaks from the activity are no longer towering above everything else in your life. They may even barely scrape above baseline. But the learning has already embedded the habit deeply. Cues still trigger anticipatory dopamine, which still pushes you toward repeating the action, even when the actual payoff has become small or even negative. You are no longer chasing pleasure. You are chasing the memory of pleasure plus the desire to avoid the discomfort of not getting what your prediction system expects. This is where compulsive patterns and addictions start to diverge from ordinary habits, although the underlying learning mechanisms are not fundamentally different, just more extreme and more focused. In addiction, cues that predict the substance or behavior become almost supervalued. The dopamine system reacts with strong bursts to these cues, which, through their projections to regions involved in attention and decision-making, can dominate the mental landscape. Other possible actions and rewards are still technically available, but they are outcompeted. It is a bit like a search engine that has decided that one website is the answer to almost every question. No matter what you type, it keeps putting the same link at the top. From the inside, this feels like an obsessive narrowing of options. Even when you consciously know that using again, or gambling again, or binging again will lead to negative consequences, your attention keeps returning to the thought of doing it, and that thought carries an emotional charge that alternatives lack. The dopamine system is not evil in this. It is doing what it does best, prioritizing what history has repeatedly taught it is the most powerful or reliable source of better than expected states. The tragedy is that in the long term, those states are no longer better than expected at all. They are often worse, but the learning is anchored at an earlier stage when they were. Notice that nowhere in this description do we need to imagine dopamine as a bucket that gets emptied or a meter that gets used up by stimulation. The idea that you ruin your dopamine by watching videos or using your phone is a metaphor that, taken literally, does not match what we know biologically. Neurons keep producing dopamine. Receptors can upregulate or downregulate somewhat, and pathways can become more or less sensitive, but the system does not get burned out like a fuse simply because it was active. What does change, very significantly, is how this system is tuned to specific cues and actions. You can imagine it less like a tank and more like a map of motivational salience. Certain objects, activities, and contexts are highlighted in bright colors on this map, indicating that your brain expects them to deliver meaningful rewards. Others are faded, indicating that, historically, they have not stood out. The repeated pairing of cues and predicted rewards repaints this map constantly. When people say they have fried their dopamine, what they often mean is that their internal map has been painted so intensely around certain stimuli that everything else feels washed out by comparison. It is as if you sat too close to a very bright screen for a long time and then went outside. For a while, everything looks dim, not because the world has lost its light, but because your eyes are temporarily adapted to a much higher brightness. You do not fix this by smashing the sun. You fix it by spending time away from the screen, letting your sensitivity readjust, and by choosing more carefully what you aim your eyes at in the future. The language of dopamine detox became popular partly because it offers a simple story. Your brain is overloaded, so you must abstain from stimulating things, and then you will somehow reset. There can be some truth inside this frame. Periods of deliberate rest from constant novelty and from compulsive behaviors can indeed make subtler activities feel more rewarding again, precisely because you are giving your prediction system a break from high-intensity signals. If you normally bombard yourself with rapid, unpredictable rewards and then spend a weekend offline in nature, you will probably notice time slowing down, boredom arising, and then, if you stay with it, small pleasures becoming more vivid. The taste of food, the sound of wind, a conversation, the satisfaction of finishing a physical task. This is not magic. It is simply your attention and dopamine pathways rescaling their expectations. However, the detox metaphor becomes misleading when it suggests that you can permanently fix everything with a short, heroic break, and then go back to your previous habits without consequence. The learning machinery does not reset to zero that easily. If you take a week off a compulsive behavior and then return to it in exactly the same way as before, your brain will very quickly bring the old map back online. Cues will regain their power, loops will reignite. A more accurate way to think about change is as gradual retraining. You are not flushing out poison. You are teaching your brain, through repeated new experiences, that different actions and sources of reward deserve more space on the map. In practice, this retraining often starts with understanding your own loops in a level of detail that you usually avoid. You might notice, for instance, that you do not compulsively reach for your phone at random but especially after certain triggers. Finishing a small task, encountering a difficult paragraph, feeling a pang of loneliness in the evening, walking into a particular room, sitting in a certain chair. You might notice that certain times of day are more vulnerable, late at night when you are tired, right after meals, immediately upon waking. Each of these moments is a cue. The existing action might be to open an app, start a binge, or drift into hours of unplanned consumption. The existing result is short-term relief or stimulation, followed by whatever aftermath you know well. To change the loop, you can focus on different parts. Sometimes you adjust the cue by altering the environment, like leaving the phone in another room, rearranging your workspace, or changing where you sit. Sometimes you keep the cue but change the action, swapping in a different behavior that also provides some relief or engagement, but with a different long-term profile. The key, from a dopamine perspective, is that the new action must become associated with experiences that are genuinely positive enough, often enough, that your brain starts to anticipate them. If you decide that every time you feel the urge to check your phone you will instead stare at a blank wall and suffer, you are unlikely to train any helpful predictions. If, however, you decide that in those moments you will pick up a guitar, sketch, go for a 5-minute walk, stretch, write down a thought, or send a voice note to a friend, then each time that action leads to a small feeling of satisfaction, completion, or connection, your dopamine system gets a new data point. Over weeks and months, the weight of those data points can shift the balance. The urge may not disappear, but the attractiveness of alternatives grows. This is also why it is so hard to talk about dopamine and habits without talking about meaning. Not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in the very concrete sense of, does this feel like it connects to who I want to be? When an activity is experienced as meaningful, the brain's reward systems, including but not limited to dopamine, often respond more strongly even if the immediate sensory stimulation is modest. Volunteering, creating art, solving a challenging problem, helping someone you care about, learning something that truly interests you, working toward a goal that reflects your values rather than someone else's expectations. These can all produce a sense of this was worth the effort, that is deeper and more stable than the quick hits of novelty. The subjective feeling might be quieter than the loud pleasure of a viral video, but it tends to linger longer and build on itself. The more times you experience that working on something meaningful leads to better than expected outcomes, the more your dopamine system will start to light up in anticipation when you sit down to do it. This is one way in which discipline becomes easier over time. At first, you are pushing purely on principle, with little internal support. Later, as your prediction circuits have enough evidence, the effort feels less like pushing a dead weight and more like climbing with a rope that sometimes pulls you upward. You cannot fake this by trying to convince yourself that something is meaningful when it is not. The nervous system is not persuaded by slogans. It is persuaded by lived experiences of effort leading to outcomes that resonate with your deeper preferences and values. Of course, life is not a neat lab experiment. You cannot perfectly control your cues, your behaviors, or your outcomes. Social, economic, and psychological realities impose constraints. There are days when reaching for the quick hit is the only thing that gets you through. There are periods where survival is the main goal, and deeper retraining has to wait. It is important not to weaponize dopamine language against yourself as a new way of saying, I am bad. The point of understanding how this system works is not to create another standard you fail to meet, but to see that your struggles with motivation, distraction, and compulsion are not mysterious moral weaknesses. They are the natural consequences of a brain that has been trained a certain way by a certain environment. That environment includes your personal history and the broader culture that profits from your attention. Once you see this more clearly, you gain a bit of leverage. You can forgive yourself a little for how things are, while still taking responsibility for shaping, as much as you can, how things will be. You can approach your own loops with curiosity instead of contempt, and you can start to design not a perfect, pure, stimulation-free life, but a realistic one in which your dopamine system is gradually more engaged by the things that actually build a life you would want to remember. In the next parts, we can move further in that direction, looking more specifically at how to work with effort, boredom, and craving in a way that respects how the brain learns, instead of constantly fighting against it. If you think back to everything we have explored so far, a picture begins to form of dopamine as a kind of quiet negotiator in the background of your life, constantly asking one simple question. Given the energy I have and the history I remember, what is worth moving toward right now? That negotiation becomes especially visible when effort enters the scene, because effort is where many of us feel the sharpest conflict between what we say we want and what we actually do. You can see this on an ordinary evening. A part of you genuinely wants to read that book, learn that skill, work on that project, exercise, or sit down to create something. Another part stares at the starting point and feels only heaviness. Your body sinks into the chair. Your hand drifts toward the phone. You think, I will do it in a bit. And then the night dissolves into small, easy loops. From the outside, it is tempting to label this laziness or lack of discipline, as if there is a simple moral flaw. But if you zoom inside, what you often find is a dopamine system doing what it has been trained to do. Weigh the predicted reward of the effortful activity against the predicted reward of alternative actions, all filtered through how tired, stressed, lonely, or overstimulated you are in that moment. Effort feels heavy when your brain's internal calculation is something like, "This will cost a lot now," and the reward is distant, vague, or uncertain. The same effort feels almost light when the calculation shifts to "This costs a lot, but I have a vivid memory that it leads to something powerful, meaningful, or immediately satisfying." In other words, dopamine is deeply involved in our sense of whether effort is worth it. And that sense is not fixed. It changes with context, history, and state. Experiments in animals and humans show that dopamine is not only about whether something is good, but also about how much effort you are willing to invest to get that good thing. When dopamine transmission is reduced in certain circuits, animals become much less willing to work hard for a larger reward and instead settle for an easy, smaller one. They do not stop liking the larger reward. They simply refuse to climb the metaphorical hill to reach it. Increase dopamine in that same circuitry, and they are more willing to choose the high effort, high reward option. In your own life, you can feel a similar phenomenon on days when you are energized, hopeful, and regulated versus days when you are depleted or stressed. The exact same task can feel completely different. On a good day, the idea of spending 90 minutes on a difficult problem has a kind of pull. You might even feel eager. On a bad day, the same idea feels like walking through mud with weights on your ankles. The difference is not only in your muscles or schedule, it is also in how your brain is valuing effort at that moment. Sleep, nutrition, stress hormones, inflammation, and prior successes or failures all influence how much dopamine is available and how sensitive your circuits are to it. This is one reason why "just push yourself" works sometimes and backfires other times. When your dopamine and energy systems are already near empty, pushing can feel like scraping the bottom of a dry well. When they are reasonably full, a little push can tip you into motion, and then the system can begin to reward the effort through small prediction errors each time you make progress. Boredom is another doorway into seeing how dopamine shapes your daily reality. Boredom is not simply the absence of stimulation. It is the feeling of wanting to be engaged by something and not finding anything in the current environment that your brain believes will be sufficiently rewarding. It is a mismatch between the level of activation your dopamine system is tuned for and the level that your current situation offers. If you have spent days or years feeding your brain a diet of rapid, rich, ever-changing stimuli, your baseline expectation for what counts as interesting enough goes up. Then when you sit in a quiet room with a single task, your dopamine system looks around and essentially says, "Is this it?" and drops its output. That drop feels like lethargy, restlessness, irritation, the urge to seek something else. You can interpret that experience as "This task is meaningless," or "I am not meant for this kind of work," or "I am broken." But those are stories layered on top. At the raw level, something more mechanical is happening. Your internal prediction circuits have been trained to expect more novelty and immediate payoff than this situation provides, so they lower the motivational signal. That does not mean the situation is actually worthless. It means that, given your recent training, it does not register as better than expected. Compared to an endless scroll of new images, one difficult page of a book will almost always lose the short-term prediction game. This has deep implications for how long-term projects feel from the inside. Think of learning an instrument, building a body of work, improving your health, studying a complex field, or slowly changing your life circumstances. At the start, these projects are mostly front-loaded with effort, confusion, and delayed gratification. The visible rewards are small and far apart. A chord finally sounds clean, one concept clicks, you finish a workout without quitting, you complete one chapter of many. The dopamine system, which operates heavily on short feedback loops, does not yet have much evidence that these activities produce frequent, better than expected outcomes. So at the beginning, it often assigns them a low value. Meanwhile, your fast reward habits are sitting right next to you, promising easier and more familiar prediction errors. The comparison is brutal. If in this early phase you expect your motivation to come entirely from a strong internal pull, you may be disappointed. The pull does not appear because the learning has not happened yet. Your brain, in a sense, is skeptical. It is waiting for data. One of the most useful ways to think about early-stage effort, then, is as an investment in training your own dopamine system. Every time you complete a small piece of a long-term project and give yourself even a moment to register that completion, you are creating a micro-experience of better than expected. You thought you would hate the whole session, but there were 5 minutes that felt okay. You thought you would get nowhere, but you understood one small thing. You thought you would quit, but you did not. These are tiny, easily overlooked events. If you rush past them, your dopamine system barely notices. If you pause even briefly, feel a flicker of pride, relief, or satisfaction, they become footholds. Over dozens of repetitions, those footholds accumulate into a new prediction. When I start this annoying, effortful thing, there is a reasonable chance that I will feel a bit better afterward than I expect. Once that prediction is in place, your sense of effort shifts. It never becomes effortless, but the internal resistance decreases. This is also where the story of dopamine intersects with the idea of self-talk and narrative in a very concrete way. The brain is always building models of the world, and one of the models it builds is what kind of person am I, and what tends to happen when I try hard. If that model is filled with memories of effort leading to embarrassment, failure, criticism, or nothing at all, then your dopamine system will naturally be conservative about investing effort again. Why send energy into actions that historically have produced worse than expected outcomes? If on top of that history you talk to yourself in harsh global terms whenever something goes wrong, I always mess this up. I'm not cut out for this. Why even bother? Then you are telling your prediction machinery in words and emotions that effort is a bad bet. The next time you face a challenge, it will remember. Its subtle output will be, do something else instead. On the other hand, if you deliberately frame your experiences differently, not in fake positive terms, but in precise and honest ones, you can slowly tilt the model. Saying to yourself, this went worse than I hoped, but I learned one thing. Or, I only did 10 minutes, but 10 is more than 0. Or, this felt awful, but I survived and could try a slightly different approach next time, might sound cliché. But from a dopamine perspective, you are highlighting small, better than expected aspects inside what would otherwise be coded as pure failure. You are giving your prediction system reasons to consider future effort less hopeless. Over time, this kind of interpretive flexibility can make the difference between a brain that shuts down at the first sign of difficulty and one that is willing to keep testing different paths, because it has learned that sometimes those paths lead somewhere interesting. So far, we have focused on dopamine as it relates to effort and external actions, but it also shapes something more subtle, your basic orientation toward the future versus the present. Dopamine-rich states often feel future-tilted. You are scanning for possibilities, imagining what might happen, feeling energized by what could be. That is why creative flow, falling in love, starting a new project, or planning a trip can feel exhilarating. Your mind is full of anticipatory reward signals. The world seems full of potential better than expected events. In contrast, when dopamine levels are low or its signaling is blunted, the future can look flat, repetitive, or threatening, and attention collapses inward or onto the most immediate sources of relief. This does not mean dopamine is good, and its absence bad in any simple way. Too much dopamine drive, unbalanced by other systems, can tip into restlessness, mania, addiction, an inability to be content with anything because the next possibility always seems more enticing. Too little can tip into apathy, depression, and an inability to start. Healthy motivation is not about permanently high dopamine. It is about flexible dopamine that responds appropriately to real opportunities, in coordination with other neuromodulators like serotonin and noradrenaline that shape mood, patience, and alertness. But in everyday life, you can sense the swings. On some days, your mind keeps generating ideas and options. You feel a kind of forward momentum. On other days, the only future that feels real is the next small escape. Recognizing that these shifts have a biological component can create space between "this is my entire personality" and "this is the state I am in right now." That space makes it easier to be strategic. On a low-state day, you might choose to simplify, rest more, or pick smaller targets rather than concluding that you are incapable of anything. On a high-state day, you might ride the wave, channeling that extra drive into long-term projects rather than scattering it across a dozen tiny distractions. Dopamine does not operate alone in the reward landscape. It interacts with opioid systems that correlate more with liking and comfort, with serotonin systems associated in some theories with patience, mood regulation and a sense of sufficiency, and with noradrenaline systems that govern alertness and focus. Why does this matter? Because the way we structure our lives can nudge these systems into different balances. If your life is heavily oriented toward chasing new things, constantly switching, seeking the next big hit or next achievement, you may keep your dopamine system highly engaged but starve your sense of simple contentment. Each peak is quickly normalized and translated into "what now?" You might know people or parts of yourself that live like this, always one step ahead, rarely able to savor what has already been achieved. On the other hand, if you aim only for comfort and predictability, you might give your liking systems plenty of gentle bumps but leave your dopamine system under-challenged, producing a sense of stagnation and low-grade dissatisfaction. The art, for a human life that feels rich, often lies somewhere in between. Enough novelty and challenge to keep the seeking system engaged, enough stability and appreciation to let the satisfaction systems do their work. Understanding dopamine helps you see when your life has slid too far in one direction. If you are constantly restless, distracted, and hungry for more, you might not need more stimulation. You might need to strengthen the circuits that let you feel enough for a while. If you feel chronically flat and stuck, you might not be ungrateful. Your dopamine system might simply be underfed with real opportunities for growth and exploration that matter to you. Very often, this exploration and growth involve other people, because humans are deeply social animals and our reward systems are tuned accordingly. Social approval, affection, recognition, and belonging all activate dopamine pathways. This is why likes, comments, messages, and visible numbers can be so addictive. They are simplified, high-frequency, high-variability signals of social reward. The brain does not inherently know that a heart icon is different from a warm look across a table. It just knows that something in the environment has historically correlated with feeling valued. Over time, if most of your social dopamine comes in the form of metrics, you may begin to unconsciously measure your worth in numbers, followers, views, responses. Face-to-face interactions might even start to feel less rewarding than the virtual ones, because they are slower, messier, and do not come with instant feedback. Yet, if you pay attention over longer stretches, a different pattern often emerges. A deep conversation with one person, a shared experience, a sense of being understood or helping someone else in a meaningful way can produce a quieter but more enduring sense of reward than a spike in notifications. That enduring quality matters, because your brain remembers not only the size of a reward, but also how long it lasts, and how it fits into your larger story about who you are. When you direct your dopamine system primarily towards shallow social markers, you train it to chase them harder and harder. When you gradually redirect it toward genuine connection and contribution, you train it to see those as better than expected instead. That does not mean you will stop caring about numbers in one grand epiphany. It means their grip can loosen as other, more substantial experiences claim their share of the motivational map. Mental health conditions can be understood in part as conditions in which these reward and prediction systems are seriously out of balance. In depression, many people describe a state called anhedonia, a reduced ability to feel pleasure or interest in things that once mattered. From a dopamine perspective, it is as if the prediction system has been told too many times that effort leads nowhere, that good things will be taken away, that the future holds only repetition of pain. Under such conditions, the brain downregulates its motivation to seek. Why keep trying? This is not a conscious choice. It is an emergent property of repeated negative prediction errors and biological factors. In ADHD, by contrast, there is often a difficulty sustaining attention on tasks with delayed or low immediate reward, while being able to hyperfocus on things that are intrinsically interesting or high stimulation. One way to view this is as a difference in how strongly dopamine signals in response to certain kinds of prediction errors, making it harder to maintain engagement in the absence of fast feedback. In bipolar conditions, manic states can involve a kind of runaway dopamine drive, where everything seems full of promise, sleep feels optional, and the seeking system is in overdrive, often leading to impulsive decisions that the person would never consider in a more balanced state. These are simplifications. Real conditions are multifactorial and involve many other systems, but seeing the role of dopamine in them can remove some of the mystery and some of the self-blame. Your brain is not a moral being. It is a prediction machine running on electrochemical gradients. That machine can, through genes and environment and time, end up tuned in ways that make life harder or easier. Treatment, whether psychological, behavioral, or pharmacological, often aims, among other things, to change the reward landscape so that helpful actions produce more reliable, better than expected experiences and harmful ones lose some of their pull. All of this brings us back, again, to you in a room at night with your thoughts, your habits, your desires, and your uncertainties. Understanding dopamine at a theoretical level is interesting, but its real power lies in how it changes the way you interpret your own urges and stuck points. Next time you notice yourself reaching for your phone instead of doing something you care about, you can see that moment as a live demonstration of your learned prediction map rather than as proof that you are hopeless. Next time you feel a wave of boredom or restlessness, you can ask, what have I been feeding my brain lately, and what is it expecting right now? Next time you feel a tiny glow after finishing a small piece of difficult work, you can protect that glow for a few seconds instead of instantly burying it under the next distraction, because you know those seconds are how you teach your dopamine system to come back to this path. The science does not give you total control. Nothing will. But it does give you levers. Adjust environments and cues where you can, shape loops in small ways, respect your biological state, be kinder in how you frame effort and failure. Seek not just quick stimulation, but experiences that your brain can genuinely encode as meaningful reward. In the next part of this long exploration, we can zoom in even more on what that might look like concretely over days and weeks. How to structure experiments in your own life that make sense through the lens of dopamine. And how to walk the narrow path between using this knowledge to support yourself and using it as one more stick to beat yourself with. When you start thinking about experiments with your own dopamine system, it can be tempting to imagine a radical reset, a moment where you delete every app, cut yourself off from the internet, move to a cabin and transform into a monk of focus and discipline. For most people, that fantasy is not only unrealistic but also unnecessary. Your brain does not need a perfect environment in order to learn. It needs a slightly better one than yesterday, repeated many times. The most important shift is not a dramatic external change, but a quiet internal decision to become a bit more of a careful scientist of your own loops rather than a judge and jury. Instead of standing over yourself saying you failed again, you have no willpower, you start asking what exactly happened just before I opened that app. What was I feeling in the 10 seconds before I reached for this? What story did I tell myself to justify it? What did I get out of it? And what did it cost me afterward? These questions are not meant to shame you, they are meant to give you data. Because dopamine is fundamentally a learning signal, any attempt to shift its patterns has to start with better learning on your side as well. Learning about the conditions under which you are most likely to fall into certain loops, and the conditions under which you are able, even occasionally, to choose differently. You might discover, for instance, that your worst distraction loops happen not when you have a lot to do, but when your tasks are ambiguous. Work on project is vague, uncertain, open-ended, and your prediction system hates uncertainty. A simple act like breaking a task into a very small, concrete first action can sometimes change the internal calculation from "this is an endless swamp" to "this is a small hill," which your dopamine circuits are more willing to climb. You might realize that the first 10 minutes of any effortful task feel worst, because your brain has not yet received any better than expected feedback, and that if you can structure those first minutes to produce some kind of small, visible progress, the rest becomes easier. This is why techniques like setting a timer for just 5 or 10 minutes, or starting with the easiest subtask, are not childish hacks but real ways of managing your own predictive biology. At the same time, you can look at the other end of your loops, the aftermath. Many of the behaviors that feel compulsive are not only rewarding in the short term but also blurry in memory. You finish a scrolling session, a binge, a gaming marathon, and you feel vaguely depleted, but you do not encode that clearly. Your brain remembers the little highs inside the session more vividly than the fog afterward, so the learning remains skewed toward "this is worth doing." One gentle experiment is to deliberately pay attention to how you feel immediately after certain habits, not with contempt but with curiosity. Do you feel more rested or more restless? More connected or more disconnected? More inspired or more numb? If you capture that in a sentence or two, even in your head, you are giving your prediction system better input for next time. The point is not to convince yourself that every pleasure is bad. The point is to let your brain see the full shape of the experience instead of just its brightest moments. The same applies to effortful activities. If you rush from completing a meaningful task straight into the next distraction, you do not give your dopamine system time to register that "this felt better than I expected." Taking a moment to savor small victories is often dismissed as cheesy advice, but in neurobiological terms, it is how you tag certain paths as worth revisiting. When you close a piece of work, when you hit a small milestone in exercise, when you finish a page or a practice session, pausing to breathe to say, "that was something," to let a hint of pride or relief spread through your body, is not self-indulgent. It is the reinforcement signal that your deeper circuits rely on. Without it, effort can remain a series of thankless expenditures, and your motivation will logically decay. Environment design is another layer where you can cooperate with your dopamine system instead of constantly arguing with it. Because dopamine is heavily linked to cues, and cues are often physical objects and contexts, changing what is in your immediate field of view can be more effective than trying to override urges purely through abstract will. If the first thing you see upon waking is your phone, your brain will eventually treat opening eyes and checking notifications as a single chunk, with all the anticipatory reward attached. Moving the phone to another room or even to a far corner, using a simple alarm clock instead, places a small gap between waking and the first hit of digital novelty. In that gap you can insert something else, even if it is tiny: stretching, drinking water, looking out of a window. Similarly, if your workspace is full of cues linked to distraction, your prediction system will be on high alert for opportunities to escape effort. A few physical changes, like having only the materials you need for the one task you intend to focus on within arm's reach, or creating a specific, deep work spot that you only use for concentrated activity and never for watching videos, gradually associate those spaces with different reward expectations. Over time, simply sitting in that spot can evoke a slightly different internal state because your dopamine pathways know this is where we usually do that kind of thing. None of this means you must banish all fun objects from your life. It means you place them deliberately so that you are not constantly fighting hundreds of silent cues every time you try to do something hard. Another powerful dimension is time. Dopamine is sensitive not only to the quality of rewards, but also to their timing. Modern life, especially with technology, compresses many experiences into very short cycles. You can get a burst of novelty every few seconds as you scroll, a micro-social signal every time a notification pops up, an instant sense of achievement when numbers jump or a bar fills. Long-term projects, by contrast, pay out slowly. If your days are arranged so that all your easy, fast rewards come early and often, and your long-term efforts are pushed to the end of the day when you are most depleted, it is no surprise that your prediction system leans heavily toward the former. One way to gently shift this is to reorder your day so that at least some of the meaningful, effortful activities happen earlier, when your dopamine and energy are more available. This does not mean you must wake at 4 in the morning and do a strict routine. It might mean deciding that the first hour after you wake, or the first free block after work, goes to something that matters to you beyond immediate comfort, before you open the floodgates of quick stimulation. It might mean creating a ritual where you earn your favorite distractions by first giving your brain a chance to experience slower satisfaction. For example, I will watch whatever I want, but only after I have spent 20 minutes practicing this skill or moving my body, not as punishment, but as a way of making sure that your day contains at least one piece of deliberate training for your dopamine system. Over months, that simple ordering can have a compound effect. The brain begins to anticipate that mornings or early evenings come with a flavor of effortful reward, and the resistance to starting shrinks a little. Social context can either support or sabotage these experiments. Because our brains are wired to mirror others and to seek belonging, the habits of the people around you powerfully influence your own reward map. If everyone in your circle spends their free time chasing short hits, complaining about work but never trying anything different, making fun of effort or calling it cringe, your prediction system will quietly tag effortful, meaningful pursuits as socially risky. They may become associated with potential rejection or ridicule. On the other hand, if you regularly interact with people who light up when they talk about what they are building, learning, or exploring, who respect boundaries around focus, who do not treat constant distraction as the only normal state, your brain starts to see those patterns as attractive and safe. You cannot always choose your environment, but you can often choose at least a few of your inputs. That might mean following different kinds of people online, joining a small community around a skill or topic, inviting one friend into a focus session, where you both work on separate things silently for an hour and then check in. Each time your dopamine system gets to associate effort with connection instead of isolation, the odds of you returning to that effort increase. You are not only moving toward an abstract goal, you are moving toward a sense of being in good company. There is also the question of how much you expect from yourself and how quickly. Because dopamine is tied to prediction error, setting gigantic goals with short timelines can backfire. You might imagine that aiming extremely high will motivate you more, but if your capacity and circumstances do not allow for that pace, you will rack up a series of worse than expected outcomes. Each missed target becomes another data point telling your brain effort leads to disappointment. A more sustainable approach, especially if you are trying to rebuild motivation after a long period of emptiness or distraction, is to set goals that are modest enough that you can regularly exceed them slightly. For example, instead of "I will completely fix my schedule this week," you commit to "I will spend 10 minutes each day on this one thing." If you end up doing 15 or 20 because you feel like it, your brain experiences a positive prediction error. You did more than expected. That creates upward momentum. Gradually, you can increase the baseline, but always with an eye to keeping a margin where better than expected is likely. This is not about lowering your standards forever. It is about using the way your biology works to your advantage. Over time, small wins accumulate into big changes, much more reliably than huge, dramatic pushes followed by collapse. As you do all of this, you will inevitably encounter days when none of your strategies seem to work. You will plan, design your environment, set gentle goals, and still find yourself 3 hours deep into some distraction you promised to avoid. In those moments, the old narrative that "I am hopeless" will try to reassert itself. This is where understanding dopamine can act as a shield. Instead of concluding that you are broken, you can remind yourself that a strong habit loop was triggered, that your prediction system did exactly what it has done hundreds of times before, that nothing fundamentally new happened. You fell into a groove because grooves are literally how the brain saves energy. The important part is what you do next, not how perfectly you avoided every slip. If after a slip, you spiral into self-hatred, you add a thick layer of pain on top of the existing pattern. Your brain now associates attempts at change with shame and exhaustion, making it even more reluctant next time. If instead you treat the slip as data, ask gently, what were the cues, how was my state, what could I tweak, and then do one small, kind action for yourself right away, you keep the door open. You might stand up, drink water, step outside, or spend 5 minutes on any meaningful activity, not to erase what happened, but to avoid letting the day be painted in one single color. This way, even on bad days, your dopamine system receives at least one signal that moving toward what matters is still an option. In the background of all these technical considerations sits the deeper question of why any of this is worth bothering with. Why not simply accept that the world is distracting, that your brain likes easy rewards, and flow with it? The honest answer is that you could, and many people do, at least for a while. But if you are listening to a long, careful exploration like this, it is probably because some part of you is tired of living entirely at the mercy of the next small hit. That part is not an enemy of pleasure. It is an advocate for a different kind of pleasure, the kind that comes from seeing your own life take a shape that you recognize as yours, from looking back at years and seeing threads of growth, contribution, skill, connection, and not only a blur of consumed content. Dopamine, in its simplest role, is about making certain actions feel worth doing. If you let the environment decide entirely what those actions are, you will end up with a motivation map that reflects algorithms and market incentives more than your own values. If you slowly reclaim some of that mapping process, teaching your brain, through repeated, gentle experiments, that effort in the direction of what truly matters to you leads to real, if modest, rewards, then over time the system that once pulled you mainly toward shallow loops can begin to pull you toward deeper currents. That shift is not instant and not total, but even a partial reorientation can change the texture of your days. In the final part of this long script, we can try to weave everything together, stepping back from the details to look at how knowledge of dopamine can sit alongside compassion, meaning, and the unavoidable messiness of being human, so that you walk away not with a rigid program but with a more forgiving and more effective way of relating to your own mind. If you have listened all the way to this point, you have already been doing something that your dopamine system is not naturally optimized for in the current world. Staying with one slow, continuous stream of thought instead of hopping from stimulus to stimulus. That alone says something about the part of you that is listening. There is a version of you that is still capable of long attention, of curiosity that lasts longer than a few seconds, of wanting to understand your own mind instead of just reacting to it. That part is easy to lose sight of when you judge yourself only by your most distracted moments. It is always tempting to define yourself by the evenings where you vanish into your phone, the mornings where you cannot get out of bed, the hours where you scroll with a pit in your stomach. But the fact that you care about those moments, that you notice them at all, that you are looking for a different way to be, is evidence that there is more to you than your loops. Dopamine, as powerful as it is, does not erase that more. It just tends to drown it out when the volume of short-term rewards is turned up too high for too long. Part of what we have been doing in this whole exploration is slowly turning some of that volume down so that you can hear yourself think again. It might be helpful to gather the threads we have been weaving. We started by questioning the cartoon version of dopamine that floats around online, where it is portrayed either as a pure pleasure chemical that modern life is destroying, or as a simple on-off switch you can hack with a weekend detox. We replaced that with a more precise view: dopamine as a teaching signal, deeply involved in wanting, effort, and prediction error. When something turns out better than your brain expected, dopamine tends to pulse upward. When something turns out worse than expected or fails to appear, it tends to dip. Over time, these pulses and dips teach your nervous system what to pursue, what to avoid, and how much energy to invest in different paths. We then looked at how this learning plays out in daily habit loops. Every time you feel a twinge of discomfort and reach for a screen, every time you eat a certain snack in response to a certain mood, every time you treat boredom with a particular escape, you are not just relieving a momentary feeling. You are training your prediction machinery. It learns that certain cues lead to certain behaviors that lead to certain outcomes. If those outcomes are consistently a little better than where you started, even if they are shallow or short-lived, the loop strengthens. That is how you can end up repeating actions that you no longer even particularly enjoy. At some point in the past, they produced a strong positive prediction error. Now your brain is chasing the memory of that improvement, even as the real payoff gets smaller. We also explored how this system is deeply tangled up with effort, boredom, and long-term goals. Your willingness to climb a hill depends not only on its height, but also on your expectation of what lies at the top. A big effort for a vague or doubtful reward feels heavy. The same effort for a vivid, meaningful reward feels relatively light. Dopamine helps your brain make that calculation. If your history is full of efforts that went nowhere or were met with criticism, your prediction system will quite rationally hesitate to invest energy again. If your history is full of efforts that led to pride, connection, or growth, your brain will be more willing to endure discomfort to get there. This is why small wins matter so much more than motivational slogans. Each time you complete a tiny piece of something that matters and let yourself feel even a hint of that was worth it, you are slowly updating a model of the world inside you. You are telling your dopamine system that this path, however annoying at the start, is a decent bet. Conversely, when you repeatedly demand from yourself huge leaps and then punish yourself for not making them, you flood that model with worse than expected signals. Next time, your body will remember and dig its heels in even more. We then shifted from theory to experiments. We talked about becoming less of a harsh judge and more of a curious scientist of your own loops. Instead of just noticing that you have once again lost an hour to your timeline, you can ask what you were feeling just before it started. What made that moment particularly vulnerable? You might find patterns. A certain time of day, a certain kind of task, a certain emotional flavor. These are your cues. We considered how to change loops by adjusting these cues, by altering environments, by making the first step of effort absurdly small, by putting meaningful activities earlier in the day when your energy and dopamine are less depleted. We examined the importance of what happens after behaviors, how you rarely encode the aftermath of compulsive sessions as clearly as the bright spots within them, and how deliberately noticing, "I actually feel more anxious and hollow now," can teach your brain that this loop is not as rewarding as it pretends to be. We looked at the opposite pattern too, how you can protect and deepen the small good feelings that come after doing something difficult but aligned with your values, instead of instantly drowning them in more noise. Environment, time of day, social context, the narratives you tell yourself about effort and failure. All of these turned out to be levers that can subtly shift how your dopamine system behaves. In this final stretch, the question becomes, what do you actually do with all of this? Not as an abstract theory, but as a living human who gets tired, discouraged, and confused. One answer is surprisingly simple and surprisingly hard. You stop expecting your brain to behave like a machine that executes commands and start relating to it as a system that responds to training. Many of us secretly approach ourselves the way an impatient manager approaches an employee. We issue orders for dramatic change, expect immediate obedience, and when it does not happen, we blame, shame, and threaten. From a dopamine perspective, this is a recipe for paralysis. Imagine your brain as a cautious animal you are trying to coax into a new environment. If every attempted step forward is met with yelling when it trips, it will quickly decide that staying put is safer. On the other hand, if each clumsy step is met with calm feedback and small rewards, it will slowly explore more. That is not childish wishful thinking. It is how learning systems behave. Treating yourself with something closer to training and care than to command and punishment is not weakness. It is alignment with the actual mechanics of change. Another answer is to accept that your life will always contain both shallow and deep rewards, and that the goal is not to abolish the shallow ones, but to stop letting them dominate the map. There is nothing inherently evil about watching a funny video, playing a game, eating something delicious, checking messages from people you like. These can be genuine sources of brief joy, and your dopamine system is right to register them as such. The problem arises when they crowd out everything else, when your day is a solid wall of small hits with no room left for the slower, more demanding sources of satisfaction. In that situation, deep work, learning, relationships, and health will always lose the internal election because they are badly outnumbered at the level of prediction. A practical, gentle response is to create protected pockets in your day or week where deep rewards get first access to your time. Not every minute, not a total life overhaul, just a few recurring slots that you treat as non-negotiable meetings with yourself. Maybe it is the first half hour after you wake up, before any screens. Maybe it is 2 evenings a week where you switch off notifications and do one specific project. Maybe it is a Sunday morning walk without headphones where you let your mind wander. These pockets are the training ground where your dopamine system can relearn that the world contains more than instant loops, that there are experiences which start slowly but pay off in ways that echo beyond the moment. There is also a deeper emotional layer here that is easy to skip when talking about neurotransmitters: the fear of disappointment. A life built mostly around small, certain rewards is safe in a narrow sense. You know that if you open an app, you will see something new. You know that if you eat a certain food, you will feel a familiar taste. You know that if you scroll, you will not have to sit with your own thoughts. In contrast, investing in larger aims, in relationships, in creative work, in self-development, carries real risk. You might fail, be rejected, be bored, discover that the thing you thought would save you does not. Your dopamine system remembers every time that happened in the past. It quietly concludes that going all in on anything is dangerous. Staying in the shallow end hurts in a different way, but it is predictable. From this point of view, many of your so-called bad habits are not just about cheap pleasure. They are about avoiding the sharp pain of caring about something that might not work. If you do not try, you cannot be truly disappointed. The cost is a chronic, low-level sense of emptiness that is easier to bear than acute heartbreak. Understanding dopamine will not by itself dissolve this fear, but it can help you recognize when it is hiding inside. I am just not motivated, or I am addicted to my phone. Sometimes, the bravest act is not deleting an app, but letting yourself want something long-term again, knowing that wanting opens you up to both joy and loss. This is where meaning enters in a way that no scan or lab study can fully capture. Dopamine can tell you that a path has been rewarding in the past and is likely to be rewarding again. It cannot tell you whether that reward fits who you are at a deep level. The feeling of "this is worth my life" is not produced by a single neurotransmitter. It emerges when your actions line up, however imperfectly, with your values, your temperament, your sense of what a good use of your limited time might be. You could, in theory, train your dopamine system to be highly motivated by things that you later regret, by chasing status symbols you do not actually care about, by obsessing over numbers that do not reflect anything you truly believe. Many people do, but the emptiness that follows is a signal from another layer of your mind. It is that layer saying, "Yes, this is rewarding in the narrow sense, but I do not recognize myself in this." The invitation, if you choose to accept it, is to slowly align your motivational learning with that deeper compass. That might look like asking, before you commit to a new project or chase a new reward, if this went well, would I actually like the person I would become? It might look like noticing which activities leave a clean aftertaste in your mind, as opposed to those that leave you buzzing or ashamed. Your dopamine system will happily learn whatever you repeatedly reinforce. You have some say in what those reinforcements point toward. It is also worth remembering that biology is not destiny. You came into the world with a particular nervous system, shaped by genetics, early experience, culture, and chance. That system will always have its tendencies. Maybe you are naturally more novelty-seeking, more risk-averse, more sensitive to social cues, more prone to low mood, more driven by achievement. Understanding dopamine and its friends will not change your basic wiring. What it can change is the story you tell about that wiring and the way you arrange your life around it. Instead of, "I am broken because focusing is hard for me," the story can become, "My prediction system is tuned in a way that makes slow tasks more challenging. I will need more structure, more environmental support, and more patience with myself when I work." Instead of, "I am weak because I keep going back to the same habits," it can become, "My brain learned very strong associations between certain cues and certain rewards. Undoing that learning will take time, and I can expect setbacks without treating them as proof of failure." Your struggles then become not isolated personal defects, but understandable outcomes of a complex system in a complex world. That does not make them vanish, but it often makes them less heavy to carry. By now, you might be wondering what a realistic next step looks like after listening to all of this. Not a dramatic life overhaul, not a 40-item plan, just one or two concrete moves that respect everything we have said. You could choose to do something very small that speaks to your future self. For instance, you might pick one habit loop that bothers you most and decide that, for the next week, you will not try to eliminate it entirely but simply pause for 3 breaths before you act on it. In those 3 breaths, you might ask, "What am I actually feeling right now, and what do I hope this will change?" Sometimes you will go ahead and do it anyway. Sometimes the pause will open a crack through which another option appears. Either way, you will have started to insert awareness into an automatic pattern, and your dopamine system will begin to receive slightly more nuanced data about the true costs and benefits. Or you might decide that each day you will intentionally create one moment of effortful, meaningful action, no matter how small, and then protect the feeling afterward for at least a few seconds. That might be writing a paragraph, practicing a skill, tidying a corner of your space, reaching out honestly to someone. These are not glamorous moves. No one will applaud them, but they are precisely the kind of repetitions through which new motivational patterns are laid down. As you do this, you will still have days where nothing works, where you feel like a bundle of reflexes and cravings, where you are tempted to throw away the whole idea of change. On those days, try to remember that even long entrenched neural pathways are not carved in stone. They are living patterns that strengthen and weaken according to use. One bad day does not erase a week of small good choices any more than one good day erases a year of neglect. What matters is the overall tilt of your efforts over time, the direction toward which you keep gently steering. Dopamine will always be part of that steering. It will continue to highlight certain paths as attractive and others as dull. But as your life becomes richer in experiences that your deeper self recognizes as worthwhile, those highlights can begin to align more with what you truly want for yourself. You may still scroll, snack, procrastinate, escape. You will also, increasingly, build, learn, connect, and rest in ways that feel clean and real. The ratio changes slowly. The person living that change might not notice it immediately, but if you could jump ahead and look back, you would. So here, near the end of this long, quiet journey through one chemical and the many stories wrapped around it, the invitation is simple. Treat your dopamine system not as a broken device to fix or a beast to conquer, but as a loyal but easily misled guide. It has been trying all along to point you toward better than expected. Sometimes it has been trained on shallow, noisy things that do not deserve that label. Sometimes it has been burned by disappointment and learned to expect too little from life. With patience, curiosity, and a bit of structure, you can retrain it. You can show it again and again that there are forms of better than expected that last longer than a notification, that feel softer than a spike, that leave you more whole instead of emptier. Late at night, when you are tempted to escape yourself yet again, you might remember not just the urge but also the animal underneath it, sniffing for rewards based on old maps. You might decide, just once in a while, to gently turn its head in a slightly different direction. Over many such small turns, the path of your life bends, not because you forced your biology into submission, but because you learned how to walk with it instead of against it.